Any city can be built out of concrete and steel, but no city can survive without money. NEOM, a project worth over $500 billion, is the biggest financial bet of our time. Saudi Arabia is selling the world an image of the city of the future. But behind the renders hides a question more fundamental than all the others. Who is going to pay for this? The authorities promise that NEOM will finance itself through foreign investment, innovation, and tourism. But anyone who looks at the numbers knows this is not just an architectural project. It is an economic project that has to function like a company, generate revenue, cover costs, produce profit. Without that, NEOM will remain forever a beautiful but empty model. For Mohammed bin Salman, this is not just a matter of national pride, it is a test of whether Saudi Arabia can transform itself from an oil state into a state with a modern economy. If NEOM succeeds, the prince will go down in history as the architect of a new Middle Eastern economy. If it fails, it will become a symbol of hubris that swallowed billions and disappointed an entire generation. Abdul Rahman says, "This is the biggest investment of our time. Whoever doesn't invest in NEOM today will regret it tomorrow." Aisha replies, "But if the numbers don't add up, NEOM will become the most expensive mirage in the world." And that is exactly where we start our story. Because NEOM's future depends not only on technology, but on whether the economics of the desert turn into foundations or into a mirage. You can't talk about NEOM without asking one simple question: who is paying for all of this? In the renders, we see glass and steel. At the conferences, we hear about the future. But anyone who has ever looked into a state budget or a listed company's report knows that dreams are expensive and the books have to balance. Saudi Arabia estimates the cost of NEOM at more than $500 billion, which in practice means we are not talking about a single project, but about a budget larger than the annual GDP of some European states. This city is not being built in a vacuum. It is rising on the foundations of the Saudi financial system, on oil money, on investments from the sovereign fund, on loans, on promises. The core of the financing is the Public Investment Fund, Mohammed bin Salman's sovereign investment vehicle. This is where the billions from oil exports flow, money that instead of covering current expenses is supposed to be redirected into the future. PIF buys stakes in foreign companies, finances contracts, and transfers money into NEOM's development. For the prince, the plan is simple. Oil is still the source of wealth, but it is supposed to become a springboard, not the goal. NEOM is meant to prove that every petrodollar can be turned into innovation and technology. But this plan carries risk, because if oil prices fall, if the budget stops balancing, PIF will have nothing left to pump more billions into the project. The second source of financing is foreign partners. Saudi Arabia invites global corporations, from construction companies to tech giants, and tempts them with multi-billion contracts. On one hand, that's an injection of know-how. On the other, it's part of a diplomatic game. Every company that signs a contract with NEOM becomes less inclined to criticize Saudi Arabia. This is an economy intertwined with politics. A contract is not only an investment, but also a way to buy silence. There are also loans and bonds that are supposed to finance part of the endeavor. Saudi Arabia is testing the capital markets by issuing securities linked to green energy and tourism. For banks and investors, this is an opportunity to cash in on the ESG trend. For Saudi Arabia, a way to spread the risk across many players. But in the background lurks a question. Is this funding based on real potential or just on the strength of Saudi PR? Most importantly, NEOM is also financed by the politics of hope. It is a mechanism in which future profits are used to justify today's spending. The authorities say, in 10 years, tourism will bring us billions. In 20 years, technology will create thousands of jobs. But today, those billions exist only in Excel, and those jobs exist only in the renders. That is why economists warn that NEOM is more of a gamble than a project, a bet in which Saudi Arabia is putting its reserves and its reputation on one card. Abdul Rahman repeats enthusiastically, "You can't build the future without investment." Dubai was also built on loans and bold decisions. We have more money than they did, so we have better odds. Aisha replies calmly, but Dubai started with small steps, and we want to jump straight onto the roof of the world. If we trip, the fall will hurt a lot more than the climb itself. And so NEOM's funding sources become part of a bigger story. These aren't just numbers in a table. They form an entire state philosophy, a philosophy in which oil is to finance the future, foreign companies are to sell their experience, and loans are to plug the gaps in the balance sheet. Except each of these elements is a promise, and promises in economics have a very short expiry date. All it takes is a crisis, a drop in oil prices, a shift in investor sentiment, and suddenly the whole pyramid starts to wobble on the desert sand. NEOM is not just an architectural vision, but also a construction of numbers designed to prove to the world that the project is viable. The brochures and presentations are full of forecasts, millions of residents, billions of dollars in revenue, thousands of new companies. On paper, it looks impressive, an economic perpetuum mobile that finances and develops itself. But in the world of economics, a projection is nothing more than a dream dressed up as an Excel sheet. The Saudi authorities claim that NEOM will generate enormous income from tourism. There are supposed to be millions of visitors every year, leaving billions of dollars behind. But the question is, why would those tourists come here, of all places? Dubai already has its hotels, Abu Dhabi its islands, Egypt, the pyramids. Saudi Arabia still has to create a brand and convince people that the desert they previously associated with pilgrimages and oil will suddenly become a global hub of luxury. The second pillar of the forecasts is technology. NEOM is meant to be a city of artificial intelligence, robotics, green energy. The authorities predict that new companies, lured by tax breaks and massive marketing, will choose to develop their R&D centers there. But the economics of innovation do not work on command. Silicon Valley was built over decades in a climate of freedom, risk, and private capital. In Saudi Arabia, innovation is supposed to emerge by decree of the prince and billions from a sovereign fund. That's not an ecosystem, that's a laboratory. And laboratories can succeed or end in failure. The third pillar is demographic projections. NEOM's documents assume that by 2045, as many as 9 million people will live in the city. It's as if a metropolis the size of London were to spring up in the middle of the desert. But where are these people supposed to come from? There are not enough Saudis to fill that plan, and migrants usually go where the economy already functions, not where it is being drawn on a computer. So the vision of 9 million inhabitants is not a prognosis. It's an incantation. If you repeat it often enough, maybe someone will believe it. The riskiest part is that all these forecasts are interlinked. If there are no tourists, there will be no revenues. If there is no innovation, there will be no companies. If there are no residents, there will be no domestic market. Each element depends on all the others, like dominoes, where one stumble can topple the entire structure. Abdul Rahman says, "It all sounds ambitious, but Dubai also started with a dream. Today the whole world goes to the Emirates. Why should we fail?" Aisha answers, "Because Dubai built its dream gradually, step by step. And we are trying to create an entire world at once, in a place where today there is nothing but sand and wind." The economics of dreams is a powerful propaganda tool. Numbers work like magic. They convince investors, spark hope, mask risk. But numbers also have this inconvenient trait that sooner or later they must be verified. And then it will become clear whether NEOM is truly a city of the future, or just an account that never balances. NEOM is not being built in a vacuum. It is not an add-on to Saudi Arabia, but its core, a project that demands a giant effort from the entire state. That is why people say NEOM is not just a city, but the transformation of the entire kingdom. And every transformation has its price: economic, social, and political. The first price is dependence on oil. Paradoxically, to finance a city meant to symbolize the post-oil era, Saudi Arabia has to pump out more oil than ever. Revenues from barrels are the fuel for the futuristic projects. In practice, this means that the transformation is being built on the very same foundation from which it is supposed to break away. And if oil prices fall, the transformation stops halfway. The second price is social spending. Millions of dollars that in another scenario could have gone into education, healthcare, or infrastructure in smaller towns are now being pumped into NEOM. The kingdom is investing in the future, but many ordinary citizens ask whether that future is not being built at the expense of their present. They have already seen luxury investments that did not change everyday life for regular people. Now they fear NEOM will become yet another place for the elite, not for the nation. The third price is dependence on foreign investors. Saudi Arabia is inviting global corporations into the project to supply technologies and know-how. But every deal also means concessions, contracts in which the profits are shared not only with the state, but also with foreign partners. A transformation that was supposed to demonstrate independence could, in practice, create new dependencies on technologies imported from the US, China, or Europe. The fourth price is social risk. The Bedouins who were displaced from the NEOM lands are just the tip of the iceberg. If the project fails to deliver on its promises to young Saudis, jobs, housing, a modern lifestyle, the resulting frustration could be enormous. Shattered hopes among the younger generation are more dangerous than any external criticism. Because if NEOM becomes a symbol of unfulfilled promises, it may undermine trust in the entire Vision 2030 program. Abdul Rahman says, "Every great change requires sacrifice. Better we suffer a little now than stay behind forever." Aisha replies, "But if the nation pays the price and the elites reap the gains, that's not a transformation. That's just trading one set of dependencies for another." The cost of NEOM's transformation is therefore immense. It is not just about billions of dollars, but also about public sentiment, geopolitical relationships, and the country's internal stability. Saudi Arabia is playing a game with the highest stakes. And if it loses, it won't just lose a city. It will lose faith in its own future. When Mohammed bin Salman talks about NEOM, he doesn't call it an ordinary city. In official documents, another term appears: laboratory, a place where the economy is to be tested like in a test tube, free from the constraints that exist in the rest of Saudi Arabia. NEOM is meant to be a testing ground for new taxes, business models, and social structures that will prove the future can be designed like a scientific experiment. The first element is economic freedom. In NEOM, zero corporate and income taxes, no customs duties, and no red tape are promised. This is supposed to attract investors who elsewhere struggle with regulations. But every economist knows such freedom has a price. No taxes means no budget revenues. So the question is whether NEOM will be able to sustain itself solely from capital inflows and business fees, or whether it will stay forever connected to the state fund's financial drip. The second element is new models of work. The authorities speak of digital management, artificial intelligence, automation. In theory, this means NEOM is to be a place where people work less and machines take over the bulk of tasks. In practice, it may mean something very different. A massive presence of migrant workers doing hard physical labor, and a small group of highly paid specialists controlling the system. The laboratory of work may thus turn into a laboratory of inequality. The third experiment is innovation funding. NEOM wants to be a global hub for startups, but startups need more than money. They need freedom, a culture of risk and independence. Saudi Arabia is promising special zones, accelerators, and grants, but can you decree a Silicon Valley into existence? And if not, will NEOM become more of a startup museum, a place where innovation is imported rather than created from the bottom up? The fourth area is green energy. Saudi Arabia says NEOM will be powered 100% by renewable energy, sun and wind. It sounds wonderful, but experts point out that the logistics of such a transformation are a huge challenge. Green hydrogen production, solar and wind farms, all of this requires billions in investments and technologies that are still in their infancy. NEOM thus becomes a laboratory in this field as well. If it works, the world will applaud. If it fails, it will be the most expensive experiment in the history of energy. Abdul Rahman says proudly, "This city will show we can be leaders in every domain: tax, technology, energy. It will be proof that Saudi Arabia is the avant-garde, not the periphery." Aisha replies, "But a laboratory does not always produce positive results. Sometimes an experiment fails, and when it costs $500 billion, failure is not just a loss, it's a catastrophe." NEOM, as a laboratory of economic experiments, is the biggest gamble of the project, a place where everything is supposed to be new, and precisely because of that, nothing is certain. A city designed to be the answer may itself become a question of whether the economy of the future can truly be created by decree, or whether it must grow from experience, freedom, and the daily practice of people. When you talk about NEOM, you get the sense this is a project teetering on the edge of a knife, between a dazzling vision and dramatic risk. On one side lies hope for the future, on the other, fear of a failure that would cost more than money alone. The balance of this endeavor is therefore more than an economic equation. It is a question of how a nation wants to see itself and how it wants the world to see it. Hope lies in the promises. If NEOM succeeds, Saudi Arabia will become something it has never been before: a global center of innovation, tourism, and technology. A city of the future could draw in millions of people, billions in investments, and hundreds of new companies. For young Saudis, it would be proof that their country is not a museum of conservatism, but a place where you can truly live like in Los Angeles, Tokyo, or Dubai, or even better. In such a scenario, NEOM would become the symbol of a new Saudi Arabia, and Mohammed bin Salman would go down in history as a reformer who not only dreamed but actually delivered. But the risk is just as great as the hope. If NEOM disappoints, it will become the most expensive failure in the history of modern urbanism. $500 billion spent on a project that does not keep its promises is not just a hole in the budget. It is a blow to the prestige of the entire state. Instead of being an example of courage, Saudi Arabia would become a symbol of hubris. The world does not remember half-successes. It remembers spectacular collapses. NEOM could become such a collapse, a mirage admired for a moment, before the desert wind blew it away. The risk is also internal. Displaced Bedouins, disillusioned youth, migrants working in harsh conditions. All this can turn into frustration that undermines the social legitimacy of the project. And if NEOM becomes a symbol of injustice instead of modernity, the prince will lose face not only before the world, but also before his own people. Abdul Rahman says confidently, "Every great victory requires risk. If it works, we'll live in a city that changes history," Aisha replies. "But if the risk is too great, the price will be higher than anything we can pay. We will lose not just money, but hope." And that is what makes NEOM's balance so dramatic. It is a project where the stake is not just the economy, but the country's identity. Where hope and risk are two sides of the same coin. If the coin lands on one side, Saudi Arabia becomes a legend of the future. If it lands on the other, it will be remembered as a country that tried to build paradise and ended up with ruins in the desert. The desert knows the history of empires. It has watched caravans of merchants who promised riches and vanished in sandstorms. It has seen cities that rose like mirages and, after decades, became ruins buried by the wind. Today, it watches NEOM, a project larger than all those before it, a city designed on computers and financed with oil. But the desert has its own laws. It doesn't care about propaganda or glossy brochures. It doesn't know the word greenwashing. It doesn't know the word innovation either. The desert knows only one thing: the bill. Whoever tries to tame its space has to pay it. And that bill does not forgive mistakes. NEOM is the biggest economic bet of our time. If the forecasts come true, Saudi Arabia will become a legend. The country that used petrodollars to build a city of the future and prove to the world that it can turn oil into technology. If they do not, NEOM will be the most expensive mirage in history, a monument to hubris and a failed dream. Abdul Rahman says proudly, "This is an investment that will change our country. We will take the risk, because the future is worth every risk. Aisha replies calmly, but the future is not built in Excel sheets. It's built in people's everyday lives. If they are missing, the desert's bill will be merciless. And that is the core of it. NEOM is not just budgets and contracts. It is a question of whether an economy can create a civilization or only a stage set, whether money can buy the future or only its illusion. And the desert, patient and unforgiving, is already waiting for the answer.